Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Christos Linteris, and I would like to welcome you to this year's Ladislav Holly Memorial Lecture, which is given by Professor Peter Geisere of the University of Amsterdam. We are having some technical problems, so we're going to stream both the introductory notes by Professor Roy Dilly of the University of St. Andrews, and then I'm going to stream Professor Geisere's keynote, which will be followed by a live Q&A with the keynote speaker. So please bear with us in these technical problems. And I would also like to give our thanks to the Ladislav Holly Memorial Trust, which is sponsoring this lecture. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. To those who are regular attendees at ASA conferences, and to those drawn from a general audience for this specific lecture. I'm Roy Dilly, Professor Emeritus in Social Anthropology here at St. Andrews. And it is a pleasure to welcome you all to the Ladislav Holly Lecture 2021, convened this year within the context of this particular conference. And it is a great honour to be able to introduce Professor Peter Geisere, this year's Holly Lecturer. But before I introduce him, a few words about this memorial lecture series. Launched in the name of Ladislav Holly, a Czech anthropologist who arrived in the UK in the 1970s. He first established social anthropology in St. Andrews in 1979, and he led the department for many years until his premature death in 1997. A charitable trust was founded to honour his legacy, and today it offers support to undergraduate, postgraduate and staff research in the St. Andrews department. It also established and helped support this Holly Lecture series. Now it's a most wonderful privilege to introduce this year's lecturer, Peter Geisere, Professor Emeritus at the University of Amsterdam and at the African Studies Centre at the University of Leiden. He has undertaken anthropological fieldwork since 1971 in numerous parts of West and Central Africa, and with a particular focus on Cameroon. He writes regularly in 4 languages, Dutch, German, French and English, and his work has been translated into many more. He reaches an extremely wide readership. Peter has had a long association with the St. Andrews department, which makes his acceptance of our invitation to give the 2021 Holly Lecture especially meaningful. He was, for example, one of the key participants in the 1991 St. Andrews Conference entitled Contesting Markets. And his support of the work we do here is greatly appreciated. Over the course of Peter's career, his work has set a standard of excellence with respect to many of the central debates in anthropology over the last 5 decades. Indeed, I cut my anthropological teeth reading Peter's work. From the 1970s and 80s, he contributed to the analysis of modes of production in society and capitalist encroachment in Africa. His focus on political economy led him to consider the role of the occult, and especially witchcraft, in post-colonial Africa. And his contributions to this area of study have been and still are seminal. For example, his 1997 book on the modernity of witchcraft, and then his 2013 volume on witchcraft, intimacy and trust in comparative perspective, have sealed his international renown in this field. Another central theme in this body of work is his focus on issues of citizenship, belonging and exclusion, both in Africa and Europe. And this is a subject of a book he published in 2009 entitled Perils of Belonging, Autochthony, Citizenship and Exclusion. Of late, he has tackled another contemporary and especially politically charged topic. That is the politicization of homosexuality, a subject that has become increasingly problematic with the intensification of homophobia in West Africa and elsewhere on the continent. He's published, in collaboration with others over the last few years, a series of articles on sexual transgression and homophobia in post-colonial Africa. He's related this theme to illicit enrichment, Freemasonry, witchcraft, among other things. Peter's work poses questions about responsibility in many different guises, and I'll leave it to him to elaborate on these and other themes in his lecture. Peter kindly agreed to record his lecture because of some of the technical difficulties we faced in setting up a reliable link. He will, I'm glad to say, be with us after this recorded lecture to take questions from you. So I'll hand over to Peter to deliver the 2021 Ladislav Holly lecture entitled Responsibility or Responsibilization, from Mafia Craft to Witchcraft to Conspiracy Thinking Today.
Thanks for the very kind introduction, and thanks to the Department of Anthropology and the ASA organizer for this kind invitation. It's a real honor for me to deliver the Ladislav Holly Memorial Lecture. Unfortunately, I met Ladislav only once when my chair invited me to St. Andrews for the first time, long ago, I think in 1989, for a seminal conference on contesting markets. Of course, I was then already very familiar with Ladislav's name and its original approach to anthropology. I'm still deeply impressed by the jump he made from Czechoslovakia to Ireland and then to UK, and that gave his view on Africa also an original twist. This lecture will relate to central themes of. In this talk, I hope to show that responsibilization is a very useful component a kind of twin notion to responsibility in order to balance the heavy moral charge of responsibility. I'm inspired in this by a recent book on mafia craft, which I want to compare to my own work on witchcraft, all between quotation marks, in order to arrive at an urgent contemporary problem, the recent explosion of complot theories with global allure. Thus, I hope to come back to a major issue raised by the conference call, the responsibility of the anthropologist. Can anthropological studies of mafia craft and witchcraft help to outline a responsible positioning of an anthropologist in the face of ever wilder conspiracy theories that the social media are letting loose on us these days? To be frank, it was not a notion of responsibility that made me accept this invitation, rather my respect for Ladislav's work, and even more directly the fact that I always like to come to St. Andrews. I've always been a bit uneasy with the notion of responsibility. I'm not sure that it's a good thing that is becoming ever more current in us. My problem with the term is that it so easily takes on moral overtone. The idea of a moral person taking her moral responsibilities seriously. In a recent paper on responsibility in Kinshasa's Pentecostal world, Belgian anthropologist Patrick Pieper notes that in Oxford English Dictionary, responsibility has 4 meanings and all of them quite positive. And she adds that un responsable in Congolese French is a leader, or at least an adult man always. He adds also that the Pentecostals add that touch to these meanings by making responsibility the end goal of the moral movement that is converged. Of course, anthropologists have worked with the responsibility notion in a widely varying way, not just in its more positive. Refer, for instance, Gluckman on witchcraft accusations, imputing responsibility to a witch. And the call for papers for this conference certainly distanced itself from a one-sidedly positive view of responsibility. But still, the more positive meaning clings to the term and the way it's used. I think as social scientists, we work with everyday notions, and we cannot define our terms independently of the overtones they take in everyday life. This is why I find the term responsibilization much more inspiring. First of all, because it refers to a process. Bringing out responsibility is never a fixed or uncontested state, but rather a process of negotiation, a struggle. Thus, responsibilization rather raises the question, who is held responsible? Exposing the deep ambiguity notions of responsibility or responsable always have correct. Actually, the more negative aspect seems to be closer to the genealogy of the notion of responsibility in Roman law. Responsalis in Roman law refers to a person who answers for another one in court, for instance, for one of his or her enslaved persons. In this sense, responsalis has moral overtones, but not necessarily positive. As said, this was why a recent book by Deborah Puccio, Mafia Craft, an ethnography of deadly silence, that came out with How this year, showed me the way in dealing with responsibility. Her book is about a long historical struggle of trying to grasp what the mafia is and was. The key concept in this is responsibilization in the sense of tracing accountability, she quotes me, Douglas. I find this twist very useful for reaching a more neutral view of the notion of responsibility, doing full justice to its ambiguity. Puccio starting point is quite different from other mafia studies. On the cover, the book is announced as studying the mafia not as a stable social fact, but as a cognitive event shaped by actions of science. It's clear that since the 19th century, Sicily was marked by a special kind of violence, but also, who or what was behind all this? The craft in Puccio-Den's title, apparently suggested to her by Giovanni Giacomo himself, the big builder of How, refers as much to the craft of the mafiosi, their hidden violence, as to the work of what she calls the anti-mafia. A wide array of observers, also academics, were struggling to get this hidden thing in the picture. Thus, her book becomes a seminal guide to all the problems of getting to know something that does not want to be known. And indeed, she knows striking shifts in time of what this mafia was supposed to be. For a long time, the folklorist perception dominated the mafia as a Sicilian particularity, a traditional Sicilianness. Puccio quotes notably as Sicilian folklorist Giuseppe Pitre, who in the early 1900s wrote about the mafia as a Sicilian way of behaving, an attitude, a code of honor that forbade Sicilians to talk to the state. But according to Pitre, it was certainly not an organization. In Puccio's view, it were notably the judges, supported by the journalists, who took the lead in trying to bring the mafia into the public eye, often at the cost of their own lives. Thus, a concerted anti-mafia movement took shape since the 1960s with its own markers and its own memorials and celebrations. The aim of the anti-mafia was to show that behind all the acts of violence, there was an organization active with its own hierarchy and strength. A turning point in discovering such an organization was the fact Judge Giovanni Falcone managed to strike in the 1980s with Tommaso Buscetta, who was to become a major pentito, repentant. Buscetta collided with the Corleone family, who gradually managed to take over the mafia, also because of their connection with the USA, think of the Godfather. He was arrested in Brazil, Buscetta, where he was trying to hide and extradited to Rome. He accepted to talk to Judge Giovanni Falcone. Puccio then offers an anthropological reading of the gradual sounding out between the two men. Critically, in her view, was that Buscetta accepted Falcone as a man of honor, to whom he could talk. Only then he was willing to teach Falcone about mafia. Typically, he justified his confession by emphasizing that he, but the Corleones had broken the rule. They, and not he himself, had become men of dishonor. In 2019, Bellocchio made a beautiful movie. Made a beautiful movie about the Buscetta Falcone tandem, Il Traditore. It's a very good illustration with what Push again is trying to show. The main thing Buscetta revealed to Falcone was the grid of the Cosa Nostra organization, its hierarchies, and the way it guarded its. What came to be called the Buscetta theorem just confirmed that it was, after all, a unitary organization. The idea of the mafia as unitary organized was confirmed a few years later in no uncertain forms by the most spectacular attack by the mafia ever. Blowing up a whole highway at Capaci near Palermo when Judge Falcone and his wife were driving there, killing them on the spot. Of course, the Buscetta theorem did not bring the end of the mafia. There's recent news about the Drangheta in a parallel organization in Calabria. And interestingly, this organization is often linked to Freemasonry. This is categorically denied by others as an idea fix of the police. But here we land into a kind of double conspiracy vision, the mafia, Drangheta, and Freemasonry. A terrible irony in all this is that the very success of the anti-mafia at responsabilization led to destructive actions, as the spectacular Capaci bombing, of an unknown scale. The veil over Cosa Nostra was finally turned away. Clearly, the mafia did exist. I hope that this example explains how responsabilization can save responsibility and counter its moralizing. Throughout Mafia Craft, throughout the book, Puccio then returns to the similarities with studying witchcraft, between quotation marks, and the parallels are indeed obvious. Again, responsibilization is a wonderful end. For anthropologists, when talking about responsibility, it's almost inevitable to refer to kinship, of old truly an anchor for our discipline, as it was in Ladislav's Holy's work. It's also an obvious topic to link to responsibility. Witchcraft seems to be the opposite, a horrible disregard of responsibility. So it came for me as quite a surprise during my first long-term fieldwork in Africa, in the Maka villages, southeast Cameroon, forest, that my interlocutors insisted that the two, kinship and witchcraft, were inextricably linked. In my subsequent work on witchcraft, I came to see witchcraft not as the opposition of kinship, but rather as its flip side. I think it's high time for a quick digression. Witchcraft is, of course, a terrible term, not just like, it's a terrible term, just like sorcellerie, fetishario, and all these other Western terms. These Western terms are very bad translations of local terms. For instance, for the Maka, the local notion of jambe is a lot broader, combining positive and negative sides in kaleidoscopic confusion. Yet these Western terms have been so widely appropriated locally that it's pathetic to refuse them. We risk to distance us from very lively discussions in society. The solution is rather to try and follow how such translations affect the meaning of both the local and the important. Translation as a productive process, producing constantly new meaning. So this so much about terminology. I think we cannot avoid using the terms like witchcraft, even if they have a big problem. To return to our topic of responsibilization, the parallels between anthropological studies of witchcraft and mafia craft may be clear. Both struggle with the challenge of trying to know something that does not want to be known, and the results are often equally confusing in cases of the mafia studies witchcraft. My first attempts at classifying witchcraft as anti-kinship, as irresponsibility, witchcraft as irresponsibility, versus kinship as responsibility, did not work at all because of my interlocutors constantly confusing the two. The first jambe, that's what Maka will insist, the most terrible form of jambe, witchcraft, is the one from the house, that is the one from inside. Witches have a hold over their relatives. Healers will always look for the witch inside the family, and the Maka are certainly not exceptional in this. In my 2013 book, Witchcraft, Intimacy and Trust, Africa in Comparison, I'm trying to show that witchcraft can be read also as the terrible realization of a hidden aggression inside intimacy. It is precisely in the inside, in the internal core, where there should be solidarity and trust, that the most dangerous forms of aggression, witchcraft, take shape. In this sense, there are certainly parallels with the mafia. Mafia also working in hiding, closely linked to family. But there are also clear differences with Puccioni's analysis. First of all, who is the anti-witchcraft as a parallel to her anti-mafia? The obvious candidate is the healer. This is Messine Merlin, the big healer, the most well-known healer in the village in the 1970s, when I lived there for longer periods of time. The healer seems to be an obvious candidate to be identified as the anti-witchcraft. In many parts of Africa, a crucial step in the initiation of the healer is the acquisition of a second pair of eyes. It's only because of this extra vision that the healer can see the witches and force them to lift their spell. Yet there is a basic ambiguity here. My Maka friends would have always explained to me that one had to have a very powerful jumper, overdeveloped jumper, in one's body to support such a second pair of eyes. We touch here upon the powerful circularity that marks ideas about occult aggression all over the globe. Protection against the jumper is to be found in the jumper itself. The healer is a witch, him or herself, can be male, female. In order to be able to heal, one has to be able to kill also. In such a vision, responsibility and responsibilization are closely intertwined. My friend Mrs. Manduga, who was a kind of a rival to the healer you see on that slide, Miss Manduga, who was very different also. She wore kind of Western dress. She was very ordinary. She looked like a very ordinary village woman. She had also a great reputation at the time as a healer. She explained to me that she had gone to her professor, Ganga, or healers professor, who lived much deeper into the forest. That's always, the healer is always far away and difficult to find, in order to get initiated, because she was so angry that her son was driven mad in the army. So she felt responsible for her son. But she used the powers that her professor had given her, first of all, to see. Healing was for her, first of all, seeing the attacker who was responsible for her client's grief. Witchcraft is a discourse about hidden forms of action and about sniffing out the witch who is hiding behind people's misfortune. All too often, the attacker is hiding inside, within the house. This ambiguity can also explain another term that came to me as a surprise. After the initiation, the healer has to take great distance, both from his or her professor and from she has become so dangerous that she will kill his professor and his relatives by staying too close. All this makes the Ganga quite equivocal as an anti-witchcraft truth. In many respects, they are rather the main representatives of witchcraft in the daily world. They are combining the witches, at least they are combating the witches, at least that's what they say, but certainly not witchcraft as such. Of course, there have also always been anti-witchcraft figures who deny completely witchcraft altogether. Certainly since the colonial subjection, but probably they existed before, there has always been a strong skepticism in African societies about witchcraft accusations, whether they are valid or not valid. In Africa, missionaries have been very vocal as anti-witchcraft champions, increasingly denying its very reality. The problem became that thus the established churches who had been established under colonial control seemed to be powerless in dealing with what many people perceived as a far too real threat, witchcraft. In Africa, the main reason behind the wave of Pentecostalism overrunning large parts of the continent ever since the 1980s is that Pentecostals see witchcraft as all too real, the work of the Satan, and thus they can deal with it, while Catholic Protestant missionaries have problems there. Pentecostalists emphatically see themselves as fighting witchcraft, but this means at the same time that they have become a powerful factor in making witchcraft appear as omnipresent. Again, deception. Most academics are also anti-witchcraft in a radical sense, denying witchcraft's very reality. But anthropologists play a special role in this sense. About a year ago, Arjuna Padarai put me in contact with Devi Nathan and his wife Govind Kelkar, two prominent Indian economists who were working on a book on witch hunts as a worldwide phenomenon. Arjuna thought I would be interested in economists working on witchcraft, and indeed I was, and I did also a blurb text for the book when it came out. However, reading the book was put me ill at ease, to say it politely. It offers a very interesting global view, but for these economists, witchcraft is a one-dimensional evil. Main interest is how to put an end to this belief in witchcraft. And hence they created a global alliance as a follow-up to their book, Global Alliance to End Witchcraft and to Eradicate the Belief in Witchcraft. I think the aim in itself is very sympathetic, but I could not help feeling that things are more complicated than what they explain in their book. And so I had difficulty writing my blurb text. Anthropologists generally have a more hesitant attitude towards witchcraft. Reading Pusho Dent's book, I had a feeling of recognition when she describes how they developed a dialogue between Judge Falcone and his main pentito, Thomas Buscetta. She describes how Buscetta was testing the judge. Only when he recognized Falcone as a man of honor was he willing to talk. I would not dare to say that my Maka interlocutors of witchcraft did see me as a man of honor, but there was certainly some testing whether I would be able to get the message. In retrospect, I think the main test was whether I was genuinely interested, whether I would not consider what they could tell me as just nonsense. Once they were convinced that I was taking things seriously, they were prepared to share secrets. And from then on, it seemed they could never stop talking, but it's special to the Maka kind of constant flow of talking about witchcraft. For this reason, I've become more and more amazed by Iris Pritchard's well-known statement that witchcraft is an imaginary offense since it is impossible. The witch cannot do what he is supposed to do and has in fact no real existence. Of course, this is strong language, and Iris Pritchard could only say this because of his separation of witchcraft and sorcery. separation that's quite problematic in most societies. Witchcraft cannot exist, it's not real, sorcery is real. Yet one cannot help wondering how he managed to make his interlocutors talk about a topic he was not prepared to take as real. The suggestion of false consciousness is never helpful for a time. Most anthropologists have different attitudes. Confirm Michael Taussig in what for me is still his best book, Colonialism and Wild Men, describing how he allows himself to be taken along during his nightly yage sessions with his Amazonian Ganga Don Santiago. The question is, of course, how far one allows to be taken along, and at this point, anthropologists have given very different answers. But an open attitude towards the reality of things that worry our interlocutors seems to be a first condition for field. We will get back to this. But of course, the main difference between anti-mafia and anti-witchcraft is in the impact of the results. The results of witchcraft in everyday life remain always highly contested, not only for outsiders, but also for the people involved. I've always been struck by the constant skepticism that surrounds debates about witchcraft in Africa, constantly testing on the reader's diagnosis, the outcome of oracles, etc. In contrast, the blowing up of a whole piece of Sicilian highway to kill Judge Falcone is an event of which the reality cannot be denied. In Pusher-Den's analysis, it was the constant prodding of the anti-mafia by the judges, but also by the support they got from people mourning killed judges as martyrs, that drove the Cosa Nostra leaders to a degree of violence that tore away the cover of secrecy, obfuscating their acts. After the Panache bombing, there was no denying possible anymore. The mafia did exist. The difference with witchcraft has, of course, direct implications for a central issue at this conference, the responsibility of the anthropologist. For Pusher-Den, there's hardly a problem here. The horror of the Cosa Nostra violence and its stranglehold over Sicilian society make it for her self-evident to support the anti-mafia activities and to oppose the folklorist view of the mafia as just an expression of Sicilian. But for anthropologists, that is already more complicated vis-à-vis witchcraft. If going along is a condition for fieldwork on the topic, some acceptance of its reality becomes a logical consequence. Indeed, Pusher-Den quotes Bogomil Jasowicz, a famous historian, but almost an anthropologist, on the need for epistemological pluralism. For people like our Indian economist, Nathan Kolkar, such a pluralism goes already much too far towards condoning witchcraft. For also historian Wolfgang Behringer, who in his magisterial global history of witchcraft reproaches anthropologists for the endless theoretical debates about terminology, thus in practice condoning ongoing witchcraft, witch hunts all over the globe. And indeed, accepting epistemological pluralism can put anthropologists before uncomfortable dilemmas when they are cited as witnesses in witchcraft palavers. What's interesting, such dilemmas are a lot more uncomfortable in the village when you are cited as a witness in a witchcraft palaver than, for instance, for asylum request in Euro-America. Then there's little problem in helping and supporting the supposed victims of witch hunts. In the village, it's quite different. The position is even more complicated for anthropologists, even more numerous recently, who opt for being initiated by a local Ganga, by a local healer. By many, this is seen as a condition to be able to work on the topic. We can add here that there are initiations in many forms and shades. However, whatever the degree and the authenticity of the initiation, there are clear ethical problems that do affect the responsibility of anthropologists. What I find quite interesting is that in practice, it's a step of diagnosis, Remember the second pair of eyes mentioned before, much more than the subsequent step of healing that creates ethical problems. Of course, there are degrees in this as well. Healing can involve also very nasty counterattacks, but it can also remain limited to working with verbal compassion, with rituals to effect reconciliation, etc. But the seeing always requires identifying a perpetrator. Remember what was said before on witchcraft as a form of action. The healer can only heal once he or she has identified from where the attack is coming, and the perpetrator is often sought close by, just sowing discord in people's intents. In such context, questions about the responsible anthropologists become sky high. The idea of multiple reality is hardly a way out. In general, anthropologists give different answers. Non-initiated anthropologists will choose contextually which reality should prevail. The academic one, let's put it like that, or the one to which they are, mixing up the text. Non-initiated anthropologists will kind of deal with epistemological pluralism as an answer. Initiated anthropologists will be less inclined to relativize the reality of the secret and they will look for a solution in witchcraft in the world of Yammer itself. I think it's high time to take the step to our last point. What do such dilemmas imply for the urgent question we are ever more confronted over the last few decades? The responsibility of the anthropologist in the face of a proliferation of complot theories in our time. Let's take a quick example with which we have all become familiar lately, QAnon. The central message of QAnon is clear. It's a call for struggle against a deep state, also called the cabal, that is taking over the world. It remains fairly fuzzy what this deep state is exactly, but certain characteristics come back all the time. It is secret, speaks in codes, it's a conspiracy of pedophiles, sometimes with cannibalistic tendencies. It's linked to Jewish protagonists, from the Rothschilds to Soros. The deep state launched Corona in order to take over the world. Trump is the main hope in his desperate struggle against his conspiracy. The role of the barehead figure at the invasion of the Capitol, he identifies himself as a QAnon shaman, and the language used has strong apocalyptic evangelical overtones. QAnon announces a storm as a moment of truth, heading to the execution of the deep state people, and a paradisical, a great awakening for us. I'm not at all a specialist in QAnon, but following some of the news on it, I was surprised how recent it is. All the more striking that it became a global movement in a few years. Very active Facebook groups in the Netherlands identifying themselves as QAnon Netherlands, also in UK and Germany. Only in 2017, it is really recent, an anonymous person, QAnon stands for Q Anonymous, started to post messages on internet forums. The person behind this Q is sometimes identified as the owner of this internet forum, Watkins, but he's very secret person. The name Q would be a secret code, Q clearance, indicating that this person has access to official documents. And an intriguing aspect, and that relates very much to mafia, to witchcraft, is the use of Q drops. Information is not provided in clear-cut packages, but in drops, some sort of illusion. Readers are constantly admonished to check themselves on internet. And of course, this is a common feature of present-day conspiracy thinking. For instance, on Dutch TV, corona deniers are getting very impatient when they have questions about information at their disposal. The answer is, go on internet. You can find everything there. Of course, internet is true. Well, what are we to make of this? How should anthropologists position themselves against the sudden popularity of such ideas? A former master student of mine, Yaron Rambam, he did a PhD in Rotterdam, not with me, published as The Truth is Out There, Conspiracy Culture in an Age of Epistemic Instability. And what makes his work very interesting, I think, is that it's based on intensive field work with complot thinkers in Holland. It's not a look from outside, but from inside, and that makes it interesting for us as anthropologists. He has interesting advice to give, all the more interesting because it is based on his ethnographical approach. First of all, he emphasizes the great variety among complot thinkers. He approaches observers, academics included, to focus on the wildest and most impressive forms, as I've been doing just now. Secondly, he emphasizes the need for taking their ideas seriously as befits a good ethnographer. Remember what I said above about the need to go along with witchcraft if you want to study. He insists on the futility for academics to try and debunk such theories, reasoning from fixed knowledge hierarchies. Our academic knowledge is superior, does not work in post-truth, what he calls post-truth time. However, Rambam recognizes that with the more ambitious conspiracy theories like QAnon, this idea of going along quickly runs into different. For instance, a few months ago, Dutch TV reported on a Corona madness demonstration, protest against the Corona prevention measures, against the local lockdown, against social distancing. With a brief interview with a young woman who looked completely okay, and she came right away to the point. We all know that cheese sandwich is the cabal's code word for a child, and we all know that after a long meeting, Obama and his staff were offered ordering cheese sandwiches. So what more do you want to know? The self-evidence in her explanations made it difficult to go along with what she was saying. Really, the basic guideline for anthropological fieldwork has its limits here. So what is the responsible thing for the anthropologists to do against such hints, such suggestions? To what extent is our preceding comparison with mafia craft and witchcraft helpful? Important may be to signal, first of all, that the arrows are pointing in very different directions in our three examples. As said before, for Pusho-Den, things are quite clear. Anti-mafia was right in identifying a coherent organization behind all the violence. So no wonder that as an anthropologist, he's on the side of the anti-mafia, breaking the silence, breaking the veil high. With witchcraft, things turned out to be more complex. The healer as an anti-witchcraft actor is working as much in secret as witchcraft itself. The anti-witch hunters are Indian economists, are loud and clear in the open, yet they are hardly revealing witchcraft since they deny that it really exists. Anthropology seems to be balancing between these two positions, radically denying or going along, depending on the. In the QAnon case, it's not only the target, the deep state that remains hidden. QAnon itself remains hidden also. The denouncers hide in the anonymity of the internet. What role then for anthropologists in the face of such double secrecy? What kind of transparency can they create? Is it our brief to take accusations seriously only in order to be able to better refute? But how? And what is refuting? Clearly showing that something is historically incorrect or physically impossible will hardly stop people believing it. In this sense, the balance of witchcraft studies is not very promising. Also in the West, people continue to believe, for instance, that children are abused by teachers in hidden cellars, even though engineers demonstrated the non-existence of cellars. Cases of which are quite well known to all places in the Netherlands, France. Just as people continue to maintain that they are autochthons, indigenous, even though historians show that their ancestors invaded the location quite recently. The question might rather be why certain ideas are so confusing. Why do they acquire such visceral power? And to continue the QAnon example, for me it's clear we have to get further than the obvious explanation that it stems from a proliferation of images through internet and social media plus COVID. That's of course the context in which there is this explosion of plot theories, but can't we take it further? Anthropologists should come up with more detailed analysis of contextual factors and techniques of persuasion. Let me end by an example rather than remaining stuck in generalization. For me and my co-author, Roger Orloff, of the project, the research project Roy, my chair, just mentioned, the explosion of conspiracy theories in the West has an effect of some Schadenfreude. I think in English it would be gloating. Our effort to relate a sudden intensification of homophobia in Cameroon to people's belief that the national elite is deeply into Freemasonry and therefore into same sex led us into a cascade of ever weirder rumors. A special one is the idea that Cameroon is becoming an anusocracy, anal penetration. Anusocracy is the rule of the anus, you could say that. Anal penetration as a source of illicit enrichment. At first sight, this is another example of old Plinius' pun, ex-Africa, sempre aliquid novi, from Africa, always something new, anything is possible. QAnon shows that modern people in Europe and America are prepared to take even stranger things for granted. Our research could be interesting in this wider context because in this case we can follow such rumors and their constant shifting for more than 50 years now. These rumors, Cameroonian rumors, have a quite long historical path. Maybe the responsibility for the anthropologists lies not in contradicting such conspiracy theory, but rather following in detail, contextualizing their shifts over time, and the struggles towards epistemological closure, struggles to hide internal inconsistencies, making something ridden with some inconsistencies appear as self-evident. I mean, it's the self-evidence of such plot thinking that we could attack by showing shifts over time and showing the way in which people try to hide inconsistencies. It's not a complete answer, but it would be my suggestion to the general theme of the responsibility of the anthropologist. Thank you for your attention.